My name is Skylar, I'm 28 years old, and if you met me at a coffee shop or a friend's barbecue, you'd probably describe me as the quiet one. I've always been the type to observe more than I speak, the one who keeps a smile on her face even when the people around her are digging into my patience. That smile, I've learned, is my best disguise. The real story begins on a Sunday morning in my mother's kitchen. My younger brother, Mason, came to me with yet another grand idea, his so-called startup, that he swore would change the world if only someone had the foresight to invest. The amount? $85,000. That was more than I made in a year working as a financial analyst, and he asked for it like he was borrowing $20 for gas. I said no. Calmly, firmly, like I'd practiced saying it for years. That's when Mason, in one of his careless theatrics, accidentally spilled hot coffee across my brand new phone. I had bought it just 3 days earlier, the one little splurge I allowed myself after months of overtime. The screen fizzled and cracked as the liquid seeped in. I remember watching him smirk as he muttered a half-hearted, "Oh, sorry," like the destruction of my things was just the price of refusing him. Mom immediately stepped in, defending him like always. "It was an accident, Sky. Don't make a big deal out of it." Her voice was soft, but her eyes told me the same thing they always did: don't you dare cross your brother. So I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just smiled. And that smile unsettled them more than any outburst would have. That night, I went home, blocked Mason and Mom on every possible channel, and left a short, cryptic note taped to my apartment door for when Mason inevitably showed up, just a small slip. By 9 a.m. The next morning, they understood exactly what I meant. When they logged into their accounts, the truth hit them like ice water. By the time Mason and Mom were waking up and checking their phones, I was already sitting in my office downtown, sipping on a latte like nothing had happened. My coworkers chatted around me, oblivious to the fact that while they were stressing over spreadsheets, I had just turned my family's world upside down. See, what Mason and Mom never realized was that being a financial analyst gave me more than just a boring paycheck. It gave me knowledge, access, and patience. I knew how people left breadcrumbs with their accounts. I knew where Mason liked to hide the money he bragged about but never reported. I knew that Mom's retirement funds were left sitting in accounts she barely logged into. They had both underestimated me for years, assuming that just because I stayed quiet, I was blind. When they checked their accounts that morning, Mason's startup fund, the one he had scraped together from shady side hustles and half-baked loans, was drained down to $4.62. Mom's emergency savings, the account she thought no one knew about, was suddenly locked, access denied without the proper credentials. It wasn't that I stole from them outright. No, that would have been too obvious. What I did was shift things, redirect them into places where only I had the key. At 9:13 a.m. Mason called. I didn't answer. At 9:18, Mom tried. Blocked. By 9:27, I got the first email, subject line screaming, "What did you do?" I didn't bother to reply. Instead, I let them stew. Let them sit in the silence of knowing something was terribly wrong but not being able to confront me directly. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one on the defensive. I wasn't the one explaining myself. They were. And that was only the beginning. By noon, I could almost feel the panic pulsing through Mason and Mom like a live wire. Mason had always been loud when things didn't go his way, shouting, slamming doors, throwing blame around like confetti. But money? Money was the one thing that could actually quiet him. And now, he had nothing. The first wave of calls came from numbers I didn't recognize, friends of his, no doubt, trying to strong-arm me on his behalf. I let them all go to voicemail. By the time I left work, I had 15 missed calls and 9 texts from unknown senders, all demanding answers. The thing was, I'd been planning something like this for months. Mason's coffee stunt wasn't the cause, it was just the trigger. For years, I had watched him and Mom treat me like the family ATM. They thought because I worked in finance, I must have endless money, and when I didn't give it to them, I was selfish. They never saw the nights I spent at my desk, eating takeout while crunching numbers for other people's fortunes. So I learned. Quietly. Patiently. I started by tracking patterns. Mason used the same passwords across multiple accounts, just slightly tweaked each time. Mom wrote hers down on a notepad by the kitchen phone. From there, it was a matter of time. I slipped into accounts they didn't even know they'd left exposed. I didn't drain everything, I wasn't stupid. Instead, I created slow leaks, redirections into accounts I built under false shells. To anyone else, it looked like they'd mismanaged their money, made a mistake, maybe even been hacked. But I left one thing they couldn't mistake, the note. Just a small slip. By 7 p.m. that night, Mason showed up at my apartment building. I didn't let him in, but I heard him pounding on the door from the hallway. His voice cracked when he shouted my name, desperate and angry. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. I heard him before I saw him. Mason's fists rattled the metal security door downstairs, each slam echoing up the stairwell like a warning. My neighbors peeked out of their doors, then shut them quickly, not wanting to get involved. That was the thing about Mason, he had a way of pulling chaos around him, making everyone uncomfortable until they caved just to make him go away. But I wasn't caving. Not anymore. I stood inside my apartment, leaning against the door, listening. His voice was raw, somewhere between rage and fear. Skylar. I know it was you. Don't play games with me. You don't know what you've started. I stayed quiet. Silence was my weapon now. Then came the softer side, the one he used when manipulation worked better than threats. Look, I'm sorry about the phone, okay? I didn't mean it. I was just frustrated. You know how much this startup means to me. Just give it back, Sky. Please. For a moment, his words almost tugged at me, the same way they always had. That was Mason's gift, making you feel guilty for not fixing his mistakes. But then I pictured the coffee dripping into my phone, his smug grin as he called it an accident, and Mom's dismissive wave like my things didn't matter. No. This time was different. Through the peephole, I watched him pace, pulling at his hair. His phone buzzed in his hand, probably Mom calling again, but he ignored it, too focused on me. After nearly 20 minutes, he slammed a final fist against the door and stormed off, muttering curses under his breath. I let out a slow breath, steadying myself. My heart was racing, but underneath it was something stronger, control. For the first time in my life, Mason was the one left outside, powerless. That night, I slept better than I had in years. But I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. If Mason was a storm, Mom was the quiet aftermath, the part where everything looks calm until you realize the damage has already been done. She never screamed, never threw things, never showed her anger in obvious ways. Instead, she specialized in guilt, in making me feel like I'd broken some sacred law of family just by standing up for myself. Her first email came late at night, after Mason's meltdown outside my apartment. The subject line was simple: "We need to talk." The body was only 2 lines. "Skylar, I don't know what you think you're doing. You're scaring your brother. Fix this before it gets worse." No questions. No attempt to understand. Just the assumption that I was in the wrong. Typical. By morning, there were 3 more messages. Each one escalated in tone. "This isn't funny. Your brother is in tears, Sky. Do you really want that on your conscience? I didn't raise you to be this cruel." I didn't reply to any of them. Instead, I poured myself a cup of coffee and reread them slowly, savoring the shift. For years, Mom had been Mason's shield, swooping in to protect him from consequences, while I was expected to fend for myself. If Mason burned through money, I was supposed to cover him. If Mason failed at something, I was the one to pick up the slack. And when I said no, suddenly I was the selfish one. But now, the shield was cracking. Mom wasn't just worried about Mason anymore, she was worried about herself. She'd logged into her retirement account and seen the locks, the errors, the redirection notices. She wasn't panicking because she cared about me. She was panicking because for the first time, she wasn't untouchable. Around 11 a.m., I got one final message. No subject line, just a single sentence. Skylar, if you don't undo this, you're no longer my daughter. I closed the email, finished my coffee, and smiled. Because for the first time in my life, I had the power to choose what kind of daughter I wanted to be, and what kind of family I wanted to keep. By Wednesday, the shift was obvious. Mason and Mom had stopped acting separately. The tone of their messages changed, from Mason's frantic threats and Mom's guilt-laced pleas, to a united front. The first sign was a text from an unknown number. We know you're doing this, Skylar. If you don't fix it, we'll go to the police. No, me, no, your brother, or your mother. Just, we. It almost made me laugh. For years, they couldn't agree on anything except one thing, that I was the designated problem solver. Now, for the first time, they were on the same side, but against me. The threats escalated quickly. Mason sent an email full of empty bravado, claiming he had evidence of my interference. Mom followed up with a calmer version. Sky, you've made your point. You've punished him enough. Just give the accounts back before this gets out of hand. But here's the thing, they had no proof. Everything I did was quiet, layered, disguised. Mason was too careless to keep track of his own passwords, and Mom had left her credentials in plain sight for years. If they went to the police, all they could do was admit their own incompetence. Still, I wasn't stupid. I knew desperation made people unpredictable. So while they scrambled, I prepared. I started moving my own assets, transferring money from my personal accounts into a safe deposit box of liquid cash, diversifying into places they couldn't touch. I cleared my apartment of anything important and rented a small storage unit under a different name. At night, I practiced calm. I cooked, I read, I went to work like nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, I was sharpening my edges. And then, late Thursday evening, the knock came again. This time, it wasn't Mason pounding on my door alone. It was both of them. The knock was sharp, deliberate, nothing like Mason's frantic pounding from before. It was controlled, rehearsed. When I checked the peephole, I saw them both, Mason pacing like a caged animal, Mom standing still with her arms folded across her chest, her eyes locked on the door as if she could see straight through it. I didn't open. Skylar, Mom said first, her voice firm but calm, the way she used to sound when she was about to ground me as a teenager. We're not leaving until you talk to us. Mason cut in, louder, angrier. You've gone too far this time. You think this is funny? You think you're smarter than us? Open the damn door. I leaned against the frame, silent, letting their words bounce off me. The old me would have cracked by now, opened the door just to stop the noise, to stop the pressure. But that girl was gone. Mom tried again. Skylar, honey, listen. Whatever this is about, we can fix it as a family. You don't need to punish us like this. As a family. The phrase almost made me laugh. Where was family when Mason trashed my phone and she told me to get over it? Where was family when they leaned on me for money I didn't have, then shamed me for saying no? After a long silence, Mason slammed his fist against the wood. Fine. Don't answer. But you're making a mistake. You're gonna regret this when the cops get involved. I finally spoke, my voice low enough they had to press their ears closer to hear. Go ahead. Call them. Tell them you handed out your passwords like candy. Tell them you let your accounts rot until someone smarter than you picked them apart. See how far that gets you. The silence that followed was delicious. For once, they didn't have a comeback. A minute later, I heard footsteps retreating down the hall, Mason muttering curses while Mom stayed quiet. I didn't move until I was sure they were gone. My hands trembled, but my smile stayed steady. I just won the first real battle. By Friday, I knew they'd try something bigger. They weren't the type to sit back and accept defeat, especially Mason. Sure enough, around noon I got a call from an unknown number. This one wasn't his usual fake-out. The voicemail that followed was clipped, official. "This is Officer Ramirez with the 19th Precinct. We'd like to speak with you regarding a complaint filed this morning. Please call us back." I listened twice, then smiled. It had begun. I didn't call back right away. Instead, I took my time, finished my lunch, and walked around the block before heading home. By the time I returned, another message was waiting. Same officer, slightly firmer this time. When I finally called, I kept my voice calm, almost cheerful. "Hi, this is Skylar. I got your message." He explained the basics. Mason and my mother had filed a complaint, accusing me of hacking into their accounts, stealing funds, causing emotional distress. He said they seemed upset, but the details were messy. Messy was an understatement. Mason was notorious in our hometown for his failed ventures and unpaid debts. Mom wasn't much better. Her finances were riddled with overdrafts and late fees. The officer asked me one simple question: "Do you have any idea what they're talking about?" I gave a little laugh. "No, officer. My brother has been struggling financially for years. I think he's looking for someone to blame. As for my mother, she's been under stress lately. I don't know why they're dragging me into it, but I promise you, I haven't done anything illegal." I heard the skepticism in his silence. "Not toward me, toward them." "All right, miss," he finally said. "At this point, it's just a complaint. Unless they can provide proof, there's nothing more we can do." Proof. That word was my shield. They had none. When I hung up, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Mason and Mom had gone to the police, and instead of cornering me, they'd only exposed how desperate and unstable they looked. And I wasn't done yet. If they wanted to play dirty, I could play smarter. They say karma is louder when it's amplified by other people, and I decided to turn up the volume. After the precinct call, I could tell Mason was rattled. But he was also the kind of person who doubled down when cornered. If the police weren't going to help him, he'd try another strategy: salvage his reputation before anyone else tore it apart. That meant his friends, his small circle of investors in waiting, and the neighborhood moms who'd coo over his latest big idea. If I wanted the revenge to stick, I needed those people to start seeing him the way I did: reckless, entitled, and always a heartbeat away from disaster. I started small and surgical. I reached out, under the guise of concern, to a few people I knew genuinely cared about Mason. I didn't accuse him. I didn't gloat. Instead, I asked questions that made them think. Have you seen his new fundraising page? The one that promises returns in weeks? Or, did he tell you about that contractor who sued him last month? People hate being left in the dark. Once doubt is planted, it grows fast. I also leveraged facts, not fabrications. Mason's unpaid bills, his missed meetings, the friendly investor who'd quietly stopped returning his emails, those were real. When I shared timelines and receipts, redacted to protect myself, the narrative shifted. Suddenly the folks who had once rallied behind Mason were asking for proofs of concept, for contracts and official receipts. They started to call him out in ways he couldn't charm his way out of. Mom suffered the collateral damage. Her neighbors had always admired her garden and invited her to their book club, but when rumors about financial mismanagement surfaced, stories of bounced checks and tax letters, people became wary. I didn't spread lies, I simply let them discover what was already there. Word traveled fastest when it didn't look like it was coming from me. Meanwhile, Mason scrambled. He sent frantic messages to mutual friends begging them to vouch for him, to tell the truth. But truth, once exposed, has a weight that lies can't carry. Some people felt sorry for him, others started distancing themselves. Investors who were vaguely interested went cold. The contractor demanded payment. An old roommate posted, anonymously, a screenshot of a text where Mason promised profits next month, and then vanished. All of this did something I didn't expect. It made Mom panic in a new way. She began to see the pattern of behavior she had once forgiven as, boys will be boys. She called me, really called, voice trembling, not to accuse but to ask how things had gotten so tangled. For the first time, she sounded less like a shield and more like a woman confronting consequences. I listened. I didn't gloat. I explained the truth, boundaries, respect, and the cost of always cleaning up someone else's mess. She didn't like what she heard, but she heard it. That quiet conversation mattered more than any social humiliation. Because revenge that only humiliates is hollow, revenge that forces reflection can change the future. By the end of the week, Mason's social bubble had all but deflated. Invitations dwindled, and his inbox grew painfully quiet. People who'd once celebrated his charisma now wondered whether that charisma had been nothing more than well-placed promises. And through it all, I kept my head down, calm, composed, the one person who finally refused to be the family's fallback plan. By the time Mason's social circle started pulling away, I could feel the shift in power deep in my bones. For the first time, he wasn't the golden boy. He wasn't the dreamer people rallied behind. He was just exposed. But exposure alone wasn't enough. People forget. People forgive. I needed something permanent, something that would make sure Mason and Mom never tried to drag me back into their chaos again. So I went after what they valued most, their credibility. Mason had been trying to woo a local investor named David Cole for months, a semi-retired tech guy who liked to throw small amounts of money at promising startups. I knew about him because Mason bragged about it constantly, convinced this was the man who'd finally see his genius. What Mason didn't realize was that David's assistant was an old college acquaintance of mine. I reached out casually. Coffee, catching up, nothing suspicious. And when she asked how my family was doing, I didn't even have to lie. I simply told her the truth, that Mason had been leaning on me for years, that he'd tried to bully me into funding his latest project, and that when I refused, he retaliated. I didn't need to embellish, Mason's history spoke for itself. She listened, her eyebrows rising higher with each detail. 2 days later, I heard through the grapevine that David had cut off communication with Mason completely. No explanation, no meeting, just radio silence. Mason must have called 10 times, but nothing. His big break evaporated overnight. Meanwhile, Mom faced her own reckoning. The HOA, tired of late dues and bounced checks, sent her a formal warning. When she tried to excuse it as bank errors, one of her neighbors, who had clearly spoken to others, asked bluntly, "Are you sure it's not just poor money management?" For someone who'd built her identity around being the responsible one, that single question cut deeper than any insult. The walls were closing in, and I didn't even have to push anymore. They were doing it to themselves. That night, I sat in my apartment, a glass of wine in hand, watching the city lights flicker outside my window. For once, I wasn't replaying arguments in my head or dreading the next guilt-laden phone call. I was free. But I knew Mason well enough to understand he wouldn't accept defeat quietly. He'd lash out one last time, desperate to claw back whatever scraps of control he could. And I was ready for it. Mason's last strike came faster than I expected. It was a Monday morning when I opened my work email and saw the subject line that nearly made me choke on my coffee. Urgent, possible fraud investigation, attention Skylar. The message wasn't from my boss. It was from HR. Apparently, someone had sent an anonymous tip to my company, claiming I'd been siphoning money from clients and hiding it in shell accounts. I didn't need 3 guesses to figure out who was behind it. Mason was sloppy, but he was also vindictive. If he couldn't win back investors or sympathy, he'd try to burn me down with him. For a moment, my hands shook. The idea of my career, the one thing I'd built for myself outside of my family, being threatened made my chest tighten. But then I took a deep breath. I reminded myself of 2 things. I had receipts. Years of clean audits, spotless records, and transparent client reports. Mason had no idea how the corporate world actually worked. I scheduled a meeting with HR that afternoon. When I walked in, I wasn't defensive. I was calm, collected. I presented files, logs, correspondence, every shred of documentation they needed to see that the accusations were baseless. Within an hour, it was over. The HR manager even apologized for the inconvenience. Honestly, Skylar, whoever sent this didn't even try to make it convincing. I almost laughed. That was Mason in a nutshell, big gestures, no substance. Still, it wasn't lost on me that he had crossed a new line. Attacking me personally was one thing. Attacking my career, the foundation of my independence? That was war. So I decided to hit back, harder, cleaner, in a way he'd never recover from. That evening, I drafted a report. Not to the police. Not to some anonymous hotline. But to the creditors Mason had been dodging for years. Names, dates, transactions, every debt he had conveniently forgotten about, every unpaid invoice, every person he left holding the bag. I didn't embellish a word. I just shined a light. By Wednesday, Mason's phone was blowing up, not with investors, not with friends, but with debt collectors. And Mom? I could hear her resolve cracking over the phone when she left a voicemail I almost didn't recognize. Skylar. I can't keep defending him anymore. I don't know what to do. For the first time, it wasn't me she was scolding. It was Mason she was doubting. And that was exactly where I wanted her. It was Mom who broke first. I could hear it in her voice the moment she called, not the sharp edge of accusation, not the rehearsed calm of someone trying to guilt-trip me, but something brittle. Something close to surrender. Skylar, she said, barely above a whisper. I can't do this anymore. For years, those words would have been unthinkable. Mom had been Mason's shield, his endless excuse, the voice that always found a way to twist things back on me. But now, her tone was different, tired, almost defeated. I let her talk. She admitted Mason's calls had become unbearable, that creditors were reaching her house phone at all hours, that she couldn't go to the grocery store without hearing whispers from neighbors. She sounded less like a mother protecting her son and more like a woman realizing she'd tied her future to a sinking ship. I don't know how I didn't see it before, she confessed. I just kept thinking he'd get it together. That if I supported him enough, he'd change. Her words weren't an apology, not really. But for the first time in my life, she wasn't standing against me. She was standing apart from him. When I didn't answer right away, she filled the silence with a plea, not for him, but for herself. Sky, I don't expect you to forgive me. But please, don't let him drag me down with him. It was a strange moment, hearing my mother ask me for protection instead of demanding it for Mason. Part of me wanted to slam the door shut, tell her she'd made her choice years ago. But another part of me, the part that still remembered being a little girl wanting her mother's approval, softened. I didn't promise her anything. I just said, you need to decide where you stand. And then I hung up. That night, I imagined Mason pacing, screaming into his phone, trying to pull Mom back into his corner, only to find her slipping away. The thought was almost poetic. For years, he'd been her shadow, always protected, always excused. But now? He was standing alone in the spotlight of his own failures. And he didn't handle it well. Because the next day, Mason snapped. Mason's meltdown was inevitable, but I hadn't expected it to be so public. It started with a rant on social media. He went live on Instagram, pacing his messy apartment while shouting into the camera. His face was red, his voice cracked, and the desperation was dripping from every word. She ruined me, he screamed, pointing straight at the screen as if I were standing behind it. My own sister. She hacked me, she stole from me, she turned everyone against me. And my mother, his voice broke on the word, my mother abandoned me because of her lies. The comments scrolled fast. Some viewers egged him on, others laughed, but most just asked the one question he couldn't answer, where's your proof? That video didn't help him. It destroyed him. Within hours, people were clipping it, mocking him, dissecting it. His so-called investor network distanced themselves publicly. A few even issued statements about never having formally partnered with him, just in case anyone thought otherwise. And then the creditors piled on harder. Screenshots of unpaid invoices circulated online. His ex-roommate chimed in with receipts, literally, of months of unpaid rent. Mason had wanted to expose me, but instead, he'd exposed himself in the worst possible way. Mom called me that night, her voice heavy with shame. "I saw the video," she said softly. "I can't defend him anymore, Skylar. I won't." Hearing that from her, finally, was like an old chain snapping loose from around my neck. But Mason wasn't done. Desperate and cornered, he showed up at my building again. This time, he didn't knock. He kicked at the door until the frame rattled, shouting my name, begging 1 second, threatening the next. My neighbors called security, who dragged him out while he screamed curses at me down the hallway. Standing behind the door, I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I just listened as his voice faded into the distance, knowing the entire building now saw him for who he really was. Mason had lost his money, his credibility, his mother's protection, and now even the last shred of dignity he thought he had. And I had finally won. For the first time in years, the air around me felt lighter. Mason had burned every bridge he had, and I didn't need to lift another finger. His own actions had finished the job for me. That left Mom, and the quiet question of whether I even wanted a relationship with her anymore. At first, I kept my distance. She called a few times, left voicemails that I let sit unanswered. Her words were softer now, stripped of the judgment she used to lace into every sentence. "Sky, I just want to talk," she said in one. In another, "I know I made mistakes. I don't want to lose you too." It wasn't an apology, not fully, but it was a start. I agreed to meet her for coffee one Saturday morning at a small cafe halfway between our homes. When she walked in, I barely recognized her. Not because her appearance had changed, but because her posture had. She wasn't carrying herself like someone ready to lecture me. She looked humbled. For the first 10 minutes, she just talked about her garden, her neighbors, the embarrassment of the HOA letters. Small talk, but I could see she was working up to something bigger. Finally, she put her hands flat on the table and looked at me with eyes that weren't defensive, but pleading. "You were right, Skylar. About everything. I enabled him. I let him walk all over both of us. And I made you feel like you didn't matter. I'm sorry." The words hung between us. For so long, I'd dreamed of hearing them. And now that they were here, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt relieved. I didn't forgive her instantly, how could I? Years of neglect and favoritism don't vanish over one cup of coffee. But I told her the truth. If we're going to have a relationship, Mom, it has to be different. Boundaries. Respect. No more protecting Mason at my expense. She nodded quickly, almost too quickly, but I could tell she meant it. For once, she was choosing me. We talked for 2 hours that day. Not about Mason, not about money, about us. It was the first real conversation we'd had in years. When I left, I felt something I hadn't expected, hope. Meanwhile, Mason's absence was becoming louder. His calls had stopped, his online rants deleted, his apartment door locked and silent. Rumor had it he'd skipped town after debt collectors showed up in person. And honestly, I didn't care where he went. For once, his problems weren't mine to solve. Closing a chapter isn't about erasing the past, it's about deciding it doesn't control you anymore. In the weeks after Mason disappeared, I noticed the silence most of all. No frantic voicemails, no pounding at my door, no constant guilt pressing down on me. For the first time in my adult life, my phone belonged to me. My money belonged to me. My peace belonged to me. Work became easier too. Without the weight of family drama dragging behind me, I was sharper, more focused. My manager noticed and quietly floated the idea of a promotion. I didn't say yes right away, but inside, I already knew, this was the life I'd been fighting for. Mom and I took things slowly. We started meeting once a week, neutral spaces, cafes, parks, sometimes just a phone call in the evenings. She asked questions about my job, my friends, my goals. For once, she wasn't pushing or judging. She was listening. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One evening, as we sat on her porch watching the sun set, she asked the question I'd been waiting for. Do you think Mason will ever come back? I sipped my tea before answering. Maybe. But if he does, it's not my problem anymore. She nodded, quietly accepting it. And in that moment, I realized the power had shifted completely. I wasn't the scapegoat. I wasn't the fixer. I was just me. A month later, I packed up the last of Mason's old junk he'd left in my storage unit, clothes, binders of failed business plans, a cracked laptop, and dropped it off at a donation center. I didn't tell him. I didn't need to. That part of my life was over. As I walked back to my car, I felt a deep calm settle over me. Revenge hadn't just been about money or reputation. It had been about reclaiming myself, about proving that I wasn't theirs to use or dismiss. And now, with Mason gone and Mom finally facing the truth, I'd won in the only way that mattered. I had my freedom. And this time, I wasn't giving it back.